y la revolución cubana seguirá.
Fidel Castro, revolutionary, prime minister, president, elder statesman, remembering the Cuban leader who led his country for almost half a century. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Cuba is mourning its longtime leader, Fidel Castro, who died last Friday at age 90. He was an iconic figure on the world stage for decades, and he dominated politics in his native Cuba since coming to power after leading a socialist revolution in 1959. Cubans will be paying their respects to him over the next several days. And as Cuba and the world reflect on Fidel Castro's extraordinary life and career, we begin with CCTV's Michael Voss, who joins us from Havana. And Michael, now that Cubans have had a few days to reflect on the passing of their longtime leader, Fidel Castro, what's the mood there and how are people responding?
Anand, the mood here remains somber, sad, subdued, very much as it has been right through the weekend, ever since the news that Fidel Castro had died. The one change now is, though, that the official tributes have begun in Revolution Square, that location where many times Fidel Castro gave those fiery speeches that could last for hours. Now the Cuban public is lining up for hours on end to pay their respects. The lines started forming around 4:30 this morning, well before dawn. Now it's dusk. They're still there in their tens of thousands. Fidel Castro's urn is not there. His ashes are not at this monument. Instead, everyone is filing past a large portrait of him, of the young Fidel, the revolutionary in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. It's surrounded by flowers with an honor guard. Now, it is the passing of an era, and I think that a lot of circumspection now about what comes next. What does it mean without Fidel Castro at the helm? Okay, he's been out of power for now 10 years. He had to step down for ill health. But remember, the majority of Cubans were born after the revolution. And they've all grown up knowing with this larger-than-life, charismatic Fidel Castro, really much a dominant part, a central part of their lives, even after he was taken ill and stepped down. Now they're going to contemplate about what happens next in Cuba without Fidel. Do the reforms speed up? Does Raul Castro become slightly more forward-looking and speed up the reforms? Although now with Donald Trump in the White House, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds for Cuba without Fidel and with a new president in the White House.
Thanks, Michael. That's CCTV's Michael Voss reporting from Havana. Fidel Castro had a major impact not just in Cuba, but also in developing countries from Latin America to Africa. What were his major accomplishments? And what does the future hold for Cuba now that he's gone? For perspective and all that, I talked with the former Cuban diplomat and educator, Carlos Alzugaray. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You were a teenager when Fidel Castro came to power in 1959. What kind of change, radical change, did he achieve in Cuba, particularly in the final years of the revolution?
Well, I think the main thing is, first, Cuba became independent for the first time in its history. Cuba was never independent. It depended on the United States. The United States decided things in Cuba. So with Fidel, we started to decide by ourselves. And that was very significant. But not only that, Fidel carried a foreign policy that made Cuba a very important actor in international politics, as a contributor to cooperation in public health, a contributor of cooperation for the end of apartheid, for the end of colonialism in Africa. I think he deserves the merit of having taken Cuba that way. The other big merit of Fidel is having transformed Cuban society into a better society, a society more egalitarian, more just, more fair, and a society where the levels of education and the levels of public health are significant. He was not able to achieve Cuba's economic independence. That was a big problem. He was not the only person to blame for that. I mean, he carried out foreign economic policies that had as the purpose the betterment of the Cuban people. Some policies didn't work precisely because Cuba had to undergo through his time, through his life, two major economic upheavals: the imposition of the American embargo or blockade or economic sanctions on Cuba, which turned the Cuban economy upside down in the 1960s, and then the end of the Soviet Union, which meant the loss of 70% of its foreign trade. Nevertheless, Cuba survived, the system survived. So I think these are his two main achievements that have to be recognized by anyone who judges him objectively.
The U.S. embargo, of course, in place for more than 50 years. If that embargo had not been in place, how much more could Fidel Castro have achieved in Cuba?
Oh, I think if the embargo hadn't existed, we could have done much better economically. We could have achieved the idea of diversification of our external economic relations. I mean, Fidel never said that he didn't want a normal relationship with the United States. As a matter of fact, when he visited the United States in April 1959, he said he would welcome American tourists, American investment, but with the only condition of respect for Cuba. If that would have happened, who knows? We might have 3 million American visitors every year. We might have important investment from companies that would contribute to the development of Cuba. What we didn't want was a repeat of the past, in which American foreign companies, including the mafia, by the way, exerted total influence over Cuba and corrupted the Cuban political system. So if the United States would have accepted what Fidel proposed, that was a fair deal, that we had a normal relationship with the acceptance of the changes that were taken in Cuba, I think we would be much better off.
He had some very fierce critics, none more so than Cuban exiles who live in the United States. How did he view those critics, and was there ever a time when he thought that the criticism that was leveled against him could in some way be justified?
Well, remember that he faced not only the criticism, but the actual assassination attempts against his life organized by the CIA and with the cooperation with the mafia. So the exiles, those who you call the exiles, which actually are right now a very small minority of the Cuban American community in the United States, the exiles took a hard line on Cuba. They were supported by the United States. They were used by the United States at the beginning. The Bay of Pigs was a classic example of the exiles being used by the United States in their regime change policy towards Cuba. So the exiles have been, these older exiles have been always unhappy with the fact that they made the wrong choice. They left Cuba under the assumption that the United States would get rid of Fidel Castro and they would return back here to the old Cuba. That didn't happen. That makes them very, very unhappy. Fidel, I think, made everything possible to have a dialogue. In the 1970s, he started a dialogue with those part of the exiled community who wanted to have a dialogue. Unfortunately, at the time, the reaction of the hardliners was to attack those people who were interested in a dialogue, which is a civilized world to go. They called them the dialogueros. It was a dirty word to be in favor of dialogue. It's very surprising. And then some people even were, acts of terrorism were committed against people who had a position of the dialogue with the Cuban government, which again, I would say is a civilized way to go. Let's talk. Let's find out where we can agree and what we can do. I think Fidel was always ready for that dialogue. But remember, the American government threw against Fidel practically everything in the book, except the direct military intervention.
How important was Fidel Castro to progressive political movements around the world, left-wing movements, if I could put it that way? One thinks about the role that Cuba played in the end of apartheid in South Africa, as you mentioned just a moment ago, or the fact that Cuban troops actually were in Angola when that country was granted independence by Portugal.
Well, I have, as a diplomat, I have worked in many underdeveloped countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and everywhere I find admiration for Fidel Castro. Remember, Fidel Castro came into the limelight of world public opinion in the 60s when all these big leaders of the third world like Jawaharlal Nehru from India, Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana, Ahmed Ben Bella from Algeria, Sékou Touré from Guinea, Gamal Abdel Nasser from Egypt. He was equated with these big leaders of the third world. It was the origin of the third world. The third world became active in international politics, and Fidel played a very significant role. He was universally admired by the people, by these leaders. They consider him part of these, of the leadership of the third world that wanted to have peace and not be manipulated by the two superpowers, but especially by the United States. He was perceived as the David that was facing the Goliath, and that he was successful in doing that, very successful.
He visited China, of course, and China continues to have very close relations with Cuba. What sort of relationship did he have with China's leadership?
I think the relationship with China's leadership, especially in the last few years, there were at some point in times their differences, but those differences were overcome because China and Cuba have common interests. They have common interests in a world not dominated by the United States, not dominated by multinational corporations. China and Cuba coincide in a number of political issues. Plus, China has become an economic superpower, and in a situation like the one that Cuba has, well, it makes very much sense to have as good a relationship in economic and political terms with China. And I would say that China is the most significant strategic ally of Cuba in the last few years. And the relationship goes beyond even economics and politics. Chinese kids come to Cuba to learn Spanish. Cuban kids go to China to learn Chinese. There is a lot of respect. Remember, these are two third world revolutions who face the same problems, who had the same origin, a long guerrilla war in the case of China, a shorter guerrilla war in the case of Cuba. And these are leaders who reached power after a long struggle for the independence of their countries and for the social betterment of their society. So there is a lot of common things between the Chinese and the Cuban leadership, and specifically with Fidel Castro.
And what kind of a legacy does he leave in Latin America? He was very close to people like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua.
His main concern was, one, to make Latin America united and more autonomous from the power of the United States. And you're seeing that right now. The Constitution of CELAC, the Constitution of ALBA, which has a joint idea of Fidel and Chavez. All these things are due to his preaching. He was preaching that Latin America should stay united, that Latin America should work with each other beyond ideological differences. There is a tendency to look at Fidel only from a left-wing perspective. But I think that if you look at Cuban foreign policy in Latin America and the Caribbean, what you're going to see is that the capacity of Cuba to have a dialogue with all the political forces in Latin America. So it's only normal that people in Latin America look to Fidel as one of the great liberators of the continent in the last 50 years.
Will his revolution survive him? Could we see now instability in Cuba, perhaps a return to a capitalist system?
No, I don't see that happening. I see, first you have to take into account that he has had a wonderful successor in Raul Castro. Raul Castro, who everybody in the past saw in the shadow of his brother. Now you see the statesman that is inside Raul Castro. Raul Castro has been able to follow the lead that Fidel Castro established, especially in terms of promoting the unity and independence of Latin America. So I don't see that as a big problem. At the same time, Raul is working on the transformation of Cuba towards what one would call the post-historic or the post-legendary period, the period of the heroes of the revolution, which Fidel and Raul represent so well. Well, biologically, they would will exit the stage, and a new generation of Cuban leaders is going to come. And this generation that was educated in the Cuba that Fidel founded, they are a result of that process. They are better educated. They are people who look forward. They are people who look for the unity of Latin America and the Caribbean. And this should guarantee that we will go forward. Of course, nobody can rule Cuba like Fidel and Raúl Castro have ruled Cuba.
Okay, Dr. Carlos Alzugaray Treto, thanks for joining us, sir.